plant is the answer to a dream as old as man himself, a giant of limitless power at man's command. And where was it science found that giant? In the atom.
The atom is more than a symbol. Locked in its tiny nucleus is tremendous energy. In a piece of uranium the size of a walnut, there's as much potential energy as in the amount of coal to fill a 100-car train. Useful electricity has been generated by the atom, a beacon for the future, a symbol of hope.
The peaceful atom is here today, working wonders, providing a happier, more abundant world for all mankind.
The atomic genie weighs in his hand the powers of both creation and destruction.
I declare, with all these atomic plants going up everywhere, I wonder if a girl's even safe in her own home. I just hope they know what they're doing.
These atomic footprints on the sands of time can never be erased. They point a path which leads to unparalleled progress or unparalleled destruction. Atomic power puts the question squarely to mankind.
Part of me wishes that I could go back and unwrite this story. Of course, I could unwrite my story, but I can't unwrite the story of what happened in my hometown. My family moved to Shirley, Long Island in 1981. I had a pretty amazing childhood in a small community with a strong sense of neighborhood and solidarity. In about 4th grade, that was the first time that a neighbor got sick and wound up dying. Over the years after that, more and more people got sick, and suddenly that became more the norm.
A 3-year state study confirms the fact that there is a remarkably high incidence of breast cancer in Long Island, but failed to uncover the cause. The statistics are startling.
I just assumed that there was some kind of mysterious curse. Breast cancer, lung cancer, thyroid cancer were really the big 3. Kids started getting sick. It was just part of the texture of the town. And really, it was only in college when someone asked, why are you going home for all these funerals? What's happening there? And I realized then that things were a little different where I grew up. I wrote this book called Welcome to Shirley, a memoir from an atomic town. And when I started, I had no idea what I was getting into. The founding of the Brookhaven National Laboratory. I started researching, and that was when the mystery started to unravel. There were 3 nuclear reactors at a place up the road, Brookhaven National Laboratory. What we didn't know at that time was that all 3 leaked, and that our town, Shirley, was right in the line of fire from those 3 reactors. It took me more than 20 years to understand that I grew up in a reactor community, and I had no idea. I suddenly saw everything in terms of how far away places were to nuclear reactors, nuclear waste spills, releases, accidents, leaks, what kind of cancers are and are not linked to all of this kind of exposure, the economics, our government, our taxes, and every step deeper I took, the rabbit hole just grew, and it made me understand and realize this was not just a problem in my hometown, but it was a problem throughout the United States. As a country, since the 70s, we've been against new nuclear reactors. As we're reconsidering our energy future, all of a sudden we are looking at nuclear as something that would save us from our energy appetite.
We need more production, more efficiency, more incentives. And that means building a new generation of safe, clean nuclear power plants in this country. Because the nation that leads the clean energy economy will be the nation that leads the global economy, and America must be that nation.
In the late 60s and early 70s, power companies were almost exclusively building nuclear power plants. One industry executive called it a bandwagon rush to nuclear power. Everybody wanted one. Overall in the United States, approximately 250 nuclear power reactors were ordered. Only about 130 of them were actually finished. 22 or 23 of them have permanently shut down due to economics or because 3 Mile Island melted down, which is a subset of economics.
Nuclear power? That seemed a real possibility. But the terror of 3 Mile Island is forcing a hard look now at nuclear power plants in the U.S. and 21 other user countries.
The common myth is that 3 Mile Island caused the end of the nuclear era. But I bought the last nuclear reactor right before 3 Mile Island. I was in charge of that procurement. And they were becoming incredibly expensive, $3 to $4 billion back then, when you could build a coal plant for $400 million. So what really stopped nuclear power was money.
Since 1974, over 200 nuclear plant orders have been canceled or postponed, causing Energy Secretary James Schlesinger to warn a year ago that the nuclear option was barely alive.
I'm not sure when I would say the nuclear renaissance started, but it really, for me, it seemed to begin with this chatter about green technology.
Global warming. Some say irreversible consequences are 30 years away. 30 years? That won't affect me.
I remember very clearly the first time I read that nuclear was green, and I thought, that must be a typo.
Today, nuclear energy provides 1/5 of America's electricity. Tomorrow, it could supply even more. And nuclear power plants don't emit greenhouse gases, so they preserve our environment. We need to reduce our dependence on foreign energy, and we also need clean air.
There was this window of opportunity that the pro-nuclear lobby really seemed to capture.
Well, the emissions are the big reason why nuclear power is green. Nuclear is the only form of base power, that's that 24/7, always-on power that releases no greenhouse gases while it's producing power. It's an industry that provides extremely good jobs and a lot of money for the communities in which they're located. But more importantly, it is a way to help ensure that we have enough energy to meet our demands, which the Department of Energy thinks will be a 28% increase in electricity demand by 2035. We have to decide how we're going to meet that. Are we going to do it by importing more foreign oil? Are we going to do it with more coal and coal mining? Are we doing it with more gas and fracking and oil shale?
To meet our growing energy needs and prevent the worst consequences of climate change, we'll need to increase our supply of nuclear power. It's that simple.
Because the cost of bringing a reactor online is so expensive, you have to have loan guarantees. The lending institutions need to know that if something goes wrong and for some reason they don't go ahead with it, there'll be somebody to backstop that and they'll get their money back. That's something that the industry needs to have really to get the kind of investment to go forward.
We are announcing roughly $8 billion in loan guarantees to break ground on the first new nuclear plant in our country in 3 decades. The first new nuclear power plant in nearly 3 decades.
What we're saying is that if you know enough about nuclear, it's a little bit why You see an enormous support for nuclear the closer you get to nuclear reactors. The people who live in communities with nuclear reactors around them understand what it brings to their community. They're comfortable with it. They're comfortable with the level of safety. And you have an over 80%, the last poll that I saw done was an over 80% support for having another reactor where you already have one.
Didn't want to know you, but I had to love you. La da 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 da. You'd be less than honest if you didn't say that this community was strongly supportive of nuclear power. This is not meant to be disrespectful. This is not Birkenstock, Berkeley. This is not liberal Boston. This is Bible Belt, Pennsylvania. In fact, let me just back up. We never really questioned nuclear power. That decision was made for us in the 50s and 60s. We're going to go down this path. God, I feel like I'm in a Rob Reiner movie. My dad would drive me down to the plant, and we'd see these clouds billowing out, and he would assure me that they were benign. You know, I believed my dad. My dad believed the industry. I just thought this was a wonderful, magical technology that had come to rescue us. I mean, energy independence, security independence. We thought it could warm homes at a price too cheap to meter. Everybody bet the house on atomic energy. All of a sudden, all these things came into question on March 28, 1979.
Could I get your attention, please? There has been a state of emergency declared on 3 Mile Island. Please stay indoors with your windows closed.
The Metropolitan Edison Company has informed us that there has been an incident at 3 Mile Island, Unit Number 2.
Question was, why didn't we notify the people? The incident occurred this morning around 4 o'clock. The safety systems functioned as they should have.
The accident began at 4 o'clock in the morning on March 28th, so it's a couple days till people get a handle on what's really happening.
This entire situation seems bizarre, but it's real and it's happening right now here in 1979. It's really happened.
The information parsed out by the company is either inaccurate or purposely misleading.
Everything is under control. There is and was no danger to public health and safety.
You know, for the industry, one of the things that occurred is they couldn't believe that citizens had the audacity, the temerity to call into question their expertise.
I don't know why we need to tell you each and everything that we do.
That's what I remember creeping me out. Just the smugness, the arrogance.
I'm here today to try and ease the level of panic and concern.
I thought it was worse than what they were saying.
Good evening. The world has never known a day quite like today. It faced the considerable uncertainties and dangers of the worst nuclear power plant accident of the atomic age.
Within a couple days, it becomes clear that the community just lost trust in the government, lost trust in the company.
It is now apparent that the nuclear accident that occurred on Wednesday morning was a lot more complicated and a lot more serious than the public was first led to believe.
Plant officials say radioactive xenon gas is still being discharged into the atmosphere from the reactor. That will continue for several more days. But is the crisis over? Once again, the utility and federal experts are at odds.
I personally think that the crisis is over, if you want to refer to it as that.
I guess my own view is that the crisis won't be over until we have the core in a cold shutdown mode.
How can you say whether or not we were close to a core meltdown?
They were struggling to come to terms with what happened 3, 4, and 5 years later, and the industry was in denial, so they never called it a meltdown.
Feet into the core. We're now approaching 3 feet.
When we finally saw the footage, it was pretty clear that it was a full-on meltdown.
We are approaching 4 feet. We're now 5.
That's something.
That's something people never really covered at TMI. This very trusting community. They believed in nuclear power, they believed in the government, and they were betrayed. When you talk about the renaissance of nuclear power, it's as if TMI never happened. There's been a number of incidents and accidents and spills and leaks, and I think it's naive to think, and even arrogant to postulate, as the industry does, that everything's under control.
The flame from a workman's candle burned out electric wires and caused a brief failure of the reactor's cooling system.
The Enrico Fermi breeder reactor near Detroit was welded shut after a partial core meltdown.
5 Tennessee Valley Authority nuclear reactors were shut down because of chronic, uncorrected safety violations. A critical cooling system failed, emergency pumps went out, and only fast action by control room operators kept a major malfunction from turning into something far worse.
It's happened again. Another leak at Vermont Yankee, this time leading to a system-wide shutdown. It's the third leak in 2 months, including the discovery of tritium in a drinking well.
Radioactive steam leaked from a nuclear power plant during the night north of New York City. An alert was declared at the Indian Point 2 plant, but no evacuations were ordered.
Inside the so-called ready room at Peach Bottom Nuclear Plant in Pennsylvania, the guards hardly seemed ready to intercept an adversary.
According to the government's own data, radioactive tritium has leaked from 3/4 of U.S. nuclear power sites. The number and severity of those leaks increasing.
A nuclear reactor on
The nuclear industry has got to come to terms with the fact that they are presiding over a technology that by definition is out of control. And I just think at this particular time, humans haven't evolved to a point where they can responsibly split the atom.
On the issue of why and nuclear power, I mean, why is it here? It has to do very much so with the Manhattan Project, which was this crash program to build atomic weapons in the United States during World War II, which was prompted by the Germans and their work with fission. And they found out that when you hit uranium-235 with a neutron, it splits, it breaks apart, and you also create a lot of energy.
Einstein sent a letter to Franklin Delano Roosevelt warning that Germany had the scientific and technical know-how probably to build a weapon of mass destruction from atomic energy, and urged the United States to do the same.
Scientists were very, very concerned, so it was a matter of getting a nuclear weapon before Hitler did. We built these laboratories, which had been secret. Los Alamos, Oak Ridge in Tennessee.
Thousands of men and women working on the project had no idea of the staggering energy they were to release.
By the end of the war, the United States did develop and use nuclear weapons. The war ends. The Manhattan Project becomes, with the end of the war, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. Just changes to that. Then came a time which is very important, I think, in understanding nuclear technology. We can continue to build nuclear weapons, and the United States did. Yeah, but what else are we going to do? I mean, we've created this huge empire, this atomic empire. How do we keep our laboratories and keep the money flowing in? What else could we do with nuclear other than build nuclear weapons? At that point, President Dwight Eisenhower gave a speech at the United Nations. Atoms for Peace was the theme of the speech.
This greatest of destructive forces can be developed into a great boon for the benefit of all mankind.
We were the ones who built the first atomic bombs, and we detonated them, and we destroyed hundreds of thousands of people in one blast in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we feel guilty about a lot of this. So we believed it and wanted to believe that the peaceful atom is going to atone for Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Brookhaven National Laboratory was earmarked as the Atomic Energy Commission facility. The government partnered with Harvard and Yale and MIT and Princeton, I mean, these great academic powerhouses, which will work on peaceful uses of nuclear technology and also do pure atomic research. What they did was figure out other things that could be done with nuclear technology as a possible ticket out. And out of that comes crazy nuclear schemes.
Nuclear explosives for large projects that are simply not feasible with conventional methods. Excavations of new harbors, big dams, canals, created in seconds. with the tremendous energy of the peaceful atom.
Take nuclear devices and blow out harbors. It would be a rather radiation-tinged harbor, of course.
Radioaction's use for food preservation and sterilization.
We're using radiation to irradiate food. And so you could eat a potato in 3 years or 5 years if you felt like eating a 4-year-old potato. This was another scheme.
Even your toothpaste may be a product of the atomic age.
Everybody wanted to do good. All the physics community wanted to see the happy, peaceful atom.
Then there was this big scheme of, well, we could use the heat to boil water and generate electricity.
Electrical power from the atom. Today, a bold experiment. In future years, a reality for homes and factories and schools all over the world.
The engine that drives a nuclear power plant is the reactor core. Uranium and plutonium atoms split apart. As they split apart, energy is released. That energy is used to, in this case, heat up water. The hot water is used to make steam that's sent to a turbine that spins a generator that makes the electricity that goes out over the wires far and wide. The plus side of nuclear power is there's an awful lot of energy in a small amount of material. The 100 tons that's in the typical reactor core can generate power for millions of homes for 2 years. It is a very enticing technology. The thorns on that rose is the byproducts. When the atoms in a nuclear core split apart, their byproducts are also radioactive. They generate heat for months to years to thousands of years later. There's a lot of energy that you have to maintain while the reactor is running and even after it's shut down. If you don't continue to manage to remove that heat, that fuel, that nuclear core, can overheat and melt down or catch on fire, and it's going to work against you in disastrous ways. The 1986 accident at Chernobyl destroyed that reactor. In 1991, there was a report in the Wall Street Journal that said the Soviet Union calculated the cleanup costs from that one accident exceeded the economic benefits derived from all other nuclear power reactors operating in the Soviet Union. There were 54 of them. The risk-reward is so different in nuclear power that one bad day at one facility can wipe out decades of good days at dozens of other facilities.
Globally, there are around 450 commercial nuclear reactors in the world, and they produce about 16% of the world's electricity needs. France gets 80% of their energy from nuclear reactors, and Japan gets about 30%.
In the United States, we have more nuclear plants than any other country. We have 104. But as a percent of our power, because we're a larger country, we have 20% of our power.
Along with that, there are 16 national laboratories spread across the United States, many of which have their own reactors for research. And there are 19 defense plants. The Department of Energy regulates the laboratory system and their reactors and defense reactors. The NRC regulates the private sector, the commercial reactors.
This is not a technology where you take for granted that the plant's going to continue to operate safely.
No, pressurizer pressure is 2,200 pounds. It's slowly lowering. Reactor strip.
It's something that you have to remain constantly vigilant about, and our inspectors play a key role in that. Our inspectors, largely to the public, what they're doing goes unobserved. They don't really know that they're out there and that they're doing this kind of work on a day-to-day basis.
We're here every day verifying that the plants are operating safely in compliance with our regulations.
We will independently assess how the equipment's working, how the operators are performing, and if the plant is responding as designed. We look at security, we look at how the site's prepared for a flood, earthquake, fire. We look at how safety-related equipment is maintained and tested. And if we find during any of our inspections that the plant's not meeting one of the NRC rules and regulations, it can range up to civil penalties, fines. A plant can lose their license and be required to shut down. I mean, we have full capability to identify something all the way up to shutting down the plant.
We try to learn from every event that occurs. After 3 Mile Island, they put in place better training for operators, better emergency response requirements. After 9/11, we put in place a whole series of security improvements, the security barriers, the checkpoints that you have to deal with.
This is the southern end. It's just unreal, isn't it? The fucking back door's wide open. Again, this is the southern gate. I think the gate should be closed. I think you should be challenged here. I think rather than put up the welcome mat, you should be telling people stay the fuck away. There it is. Nobody's in there. I mean, a guard booth unoccupied.
All the plants are required to have what's known as a radiological environmental monitoring program, and they are required to do monitoring in the area of the plant. They have to go out and take samples of vegetation, samples of dairy, water samples, aquatic samples, all of that, and report that data back to us. And then we will go out and do inspections of these programs on a regular basis to make sure it's living up to its requirements.
This is interesting. Every year they have to produce a REMP, which is like their environmental monitoring program, and it looks really impressive and it's glossy, and you'll go back and you'll see these are the results from this, that, and the other thing. Well, here's their terrestrial garden, you know, where they grab some of their samples. They still actually haven't replaced the names here. This is kind of dated. GPU Nuclear really not around. Amergen really doesn't exist. So it's actually Exelon that does the environmental impact assessment. Here are your grab samples, due east from a plant that emits radiation due north. So, you know, you can make up your own mind, but if you don't look, you don't find. Now, nuclear power a lot of times, and most of the time, will stay within its cage. But nuclear power by definition is an uncontrolled reaction, and when you lose control, it's just like a jailbreak, and all hell breaks out. That's a hell of a price to pay. I hate to say this, but there's a couple things that are going to have to occur for things to change. Probably a bad thing. You know, it seems that humans respond to catastrophe in a positive way. Whether it's 3 Mile Island, whether it's 9/11, whether it's Haiti, sometimes you have to be jolted back to reality.
It's been nearly 24 hours since a powerful earthquake touched off a huge tsunami that swept across Japan's east coast. The quake, a magnitude 8.9, was the 5th largest in modern history.
Nearly a dozen nuclear power plants were shut down, including one 170 miles northeast of Tokyo. The cooling system failed when the electricity went out.
Tonight, the crisis has taken another turn. We're in the middle of covering a full-blown nuclear scare in Japan. There are 17 nuclear power plants across that nation, 54 separate nuclear reactors. One plant in particular, though, is in trouble, the Fukushima plant.
Japanese authorities declared a state of emergency at that nuclear plant damaged by the quake as radiation levels spiked.
Japanese officials say they have lost control of 2 reactors. The fear is those reactors could be headed for a meltdown.
Hydrogen explosion has been reported at Japan's Fukushima Daiichi plant. 3 people have been hurt, 7 are now missing.
The concern here, of course, the spread of radiation. People are saying, what exactly is a meltdown?
With the big push lately to restart our long-stalled expansion of America's nuclear power capability, this Japanese disaster is causing some real concern and soul-searching. Should it?
March 23rd, it is March 23rd, isn't it? The days are all kind of blending together right now. It's almost 2 weeks after the disaster in Japan. The The news continues to get worse over there. We're sitting here in New York, and there are stories coming out every time you turn around about Indian Point. Could it happen here? What are the risks?
Nuclear power. I don't want Indian Point. I live down the street. It's like at a cul-de-sac, and I'm just down the. I don't want that anymore. How can we get him to take that away? The governor.
For 10 years, Riverkeeper has been watching Indian Point from the standpoint of safety.
In fact, even one NRC official said that if we had a chance to relicense that reactor, knowing today, we probably would not license that reactor.
Yeah, that's, as the kids say, a no-brainer.
Before the Japan earthquakes, people were not paying attention to the risk of accident, risk of radiation release. Now they are.
Is Indian Point safe? New Yorkers are anxiously asking that question as Japan reels. Tuesday, the nation's top nuclear watchdog gave a qualified answer.
We believe, based on all the information we have now, that Indian Point continues to meet our standards and operate safely and securely.
The problem is that to some, the standards aren't tough enough at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The agency has granted Indian Point numerous exceptions to safety rules at the site, which sits astride two fault lines.
Indian Point was built at a time when we didn't understand how big the earthquake risk really was. They estimated that the worst earthquake that we would have in this area would be a 3.0 quake on the Richter scale. The research done by Columbia University shows that there's not one, but two fault lines that cross about a mile north of Indian Point. And we learned that we could have a 7.0 earthquake. Now, the people who run Indian Point say we can handle a 6.0 quake. So not only are they running a dangerous plant, but they can't do basic math because the 7.0 quake is 30 times more powerful than a 6.0 quake. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission requires in the United States a 10-mile radius evacuation plan.
Regulators told Americans to stay 50 miles away from the stricken Japanese plant, but the evacuation plan here only has a radius of 10 miles.
Indian Point is 34 miles north of Times Square. There's 20 million Americans who live and work within 50 miles of Indian Point. You certainly wouldn't have a prayer in an emergency where, like Fukushima, you need to evacuate 50 miles.
The plant's owners and its opponents agree on this point. There is right now no feasible plan to safely and quickly evacuate 20 million people from a 50-mile danger zone.
I wouldn't anticipate that there's a situation, a reasonable scenario at Indian Point that would ever warrant it.
This is one of the oldest plants in the country. It's near more people than any other plant in the country. It's the plant with the greatest earthquake risk, and it's got no viable evacuation plan. Well, guess what? The relicensing hearing is in the fall of 2011.
The stakes are really high right now because so many of these plants are coming up or about to come up for relicensure. When they were first built, they received a license for 40 years. If it's relicensed, typically for 20 years, these reactors then will be 60 years old, and the technology is aging. Simply the parts are aging. There are reactors where they're leaking things into the ground and the water.
Currently, Indian Point is in that process of license renewal. There is hearings coming up, so that process can work itself out.
A license renewal, at this point, it's up to headquarters and the courts and the hearing process.
So let's look at the relicensing process. Do they study whether or not the evacuation plan is still viable? Hell no. Are they going to study the earthquake risk at Indian Point during this relicensing process? Hell no. Are they going to study the fire risk at Indian Point? No, they've already decided that's okay.
The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is under a lot of pressure to not push for safety upgrades that will require additional capital expenses. And instead, they're being pushed to move the goalposts. It's kind of like if the NFL were to move the goalposts to the 50-yard line because most of its players are aging and a lot of them need hip replacements. Every single plant that's applied to be relicensed has been accepted.
Even Vermont Yankee, a plant where they had a collapse of a cooling tower, for God's sake, still relicensed. I don't think they have a stamp in their office for license denied. Now, in the wake of Fukushima, they better order that stamp, because so many people are going to tell the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we demand you consider earthquake risk. We demand you consider evacuation issues. We'll close this plant.
The trace amounts of radioactive iodine linked to Japan's criminal have turned up in rainwater samples as far away as Massachusetts. There you go, bud. The friendly atom, spreading its love. Hello? Is this Irish television? Yeah, let's do noon. Now I'm expecting some autographed disc from Bono. Silvio, it's Eric Epstein calling from Harrisburg. Yeah, I have been a busy man. At one point, you're saying you've identified elevated levels of radiation. On the other side, you're saying that no increased levels of radiation were found. You can't have. Everybody keeps talking about the half-life of radiation. We should probably start talking about the half-life of memory. Because I gotta tell you, absent this accident in Japan, people were willing to buy the myths. I am expecting a news crew out here, and I'm just wondering the estimated time of arrival because I have another crew coming as well. And I didn't want them to get into a death match for my media profile. All right. Hey, Rose, you're not in this. Hey, go. All right. We're taking her to the Chinese buffet.
Okay, and today we're at the 32nd anniversary.
Well, it's 32 years since the accident began. In '79, you didn't have the 24/7 news cycle. I think one of the differences today is that there's a boatload of information out there, but also a conflict with facts.
They need to get a power source to ensure that they continue flooding that reactor with water. And over a couple of days, it will cool down and it will be fine.
Okay, well, Jack Spencer, we are all crossing our fingers that you are right. Thanks for joining us.
The device to cool the fuel rods has been dysfunctioned, and at one point in time, the water level did start to fall, and the fuel rods were exposed above the water.
Nobody in the Japanese public is being exposed to doses of radiation that would even be close to harmful.
Radiation has spread from these reactors, and the level seems very high.
Radiation in excess of what the government says are the minimum amounts you should be exposed to are actually good for you and reduce cases of cancer.
The column is entitled A Glowing Report on Radiation.
Radiation just seems so abstract. For the most part, you can't see it, feel it, or taste it. So it adds to what I would call the maniacal nature of the threat. I think people are more comfortable with a tactile image. Whether or a fire or something they can see, a flood, earthquake. When you're running from the invisible, there's a psychological component to them. It's almost, I don't want to say terror, but the fear of the unknown. So when you take the wind and the density, you will find that's where we put our monitors. We now have a very sophisticated radiation monitoring network. Our commitment to the community is never, ever again will you be dependent on the government or the industry for radiation readings. We have innovated a new monitor with a router hooked up to your computer so that we can just go and take the information on a real-time basis. The industry and the government seem to think this is a settled matter. And what I've always said, and I know people bristle when I say this, radiogenic cancers take decades. Not all of them, but some of them take decades until they manifest, and you can document. And basically, I think the government, the industry's thrown in the towel and said, nobody was killed at TMI. I think everybody in the area knows somebody who has had cancer and suspect that it's been linked to TMI. When you start talking about nuclear power and health effects, it makes people uncomfortable, and it should, because there is a nexus, there is a connection. Exposure to radiation is not a good thing. Every exposure is a potential overexposure. That's reality. You can make any regulation you want, you can create any number you want, but you cannot refute what is known. and that is getting exposed to radiation is not healthy. I mean, most nuclear power plants leak. They emit radiation on a daily basis. This is a fact of life. But it doesn't excite the same kind of outrage as other technology. You know, nuclear power is more of a stealth health threat. You know, it happens incrementally, it happens slowly, and because of that, I think it's difficult for people to get their arms around.
So you'll look at me and not the camera?
Okay.
We won't hear my voice on this?
No.
You can try and incorporate my question in your answer?
Okay.
That's about it. We can stop and start.
Let's go.
Okay. So what's your name and what do you do?
Helen Caldecott. I run around the world like a chook without a head.
We now have a group of doctors called Physicians for Social Responsibility. We're going out giving grand rounds in Yale, Harvard, all over, teaching the medical profession about the dangers of nuclear power and weapons.
I spent my life, much of it, running around the world, worried about radiation.
People who live down there in those houses are dying of cancer. They're dying of cancer caused by that plant.
No radiation is safe, and already background radiation produces 20 to 30% of the cancer we already see and always has. And I'm a paediatrician. I took the Hippocratic Oath to save lives. That's my vocation. It's like being a medical nun, and I will keep going until I drop dead, I suppose. On my tombstone they can write, "She tried."
Yes, the situation is under control, and yes, we know what we're doing, and shortly the plant will be in
He's saying this is a complete meltdown. All these conflicting reports, they say no water's in the reactors, but now they're dropping water in the reactors. I guess the truth is maybe the secretary's right. Maybe we don't know.
Mankind is so incredibly
stupid.
stupid.
Serious situation that is growing more grim by the hour.
Incredibly stupid.
I think we have to act accordingly.
Building 6 reactors on an earthquake fault.
A Fox News channel
They're nuts.
expert.
Right. I think the biggest problem we have, the American public, is our deficit of knowledge. But
My nickname at home is Henny Pen because it was Henny Pen. That story my father told me. He went to tell the king the sky was falling down. So guess what? I haven't done it because they call me Hen or Henny Pen in my family, but that's what I've done. Isn't that funny? It took me years to get my head around REMs and RADs. RAD is a physical dose of radiation if you get an X-ray. REM is the absorbed biological dose of radiation, what it does to the cells. What people don't know is that a single mutation in a single regulatory gene caused by a single alpha particle can kill you. There's a whole variety of radiation, and it's imperative people understand this. There are X-rays, which we've all been aware of and we've all been irradiated. Never have an unnecessary X-ray. I had 2 CT scans the other day at the insistence of my daughter. And I got 22 REMs, which is a massive dose, and she said, "Don't worry, Mum, you're too old now to get your cancer, you'll die before you get it," which made me feel very much reassured. Then there are gamma rays, which are like X-rays, non-particulate. They go straight through your body. They don't make you radioactive, but in the instant they go through you, they can mutate a gene. Then there's alpha radiation, which is particulate, emitted from an unstable alpha-emitting atom like plutonium, like uranium. They don't affect you if they land on your skin, but if you inhale them or ingest them and they land in various organs, the surrounding cells of that tiny particle get a huge dose of radiation. Most die, but as radiation decreases with the square of the distance on the periphery of that volume of cells, cells remain viable, their regulatory genes become mutated, and the cell, years later, instead of dividing into 2 in a regulated fashion, makes trillions of cells, and that's a cancer. Then there are beta particles. Americans say beta. I say beta. And they're electrons, which are smaller than alpha particles, do the same thing, damage genes. So later you may incubate cancer, some 2 to 60 years later. Each dose of radiation you receive is cumulative. It adds to the risk of you getting cancer. No radiation is safe. These isotopes, strontium-90, cesium-137, radioactive iodine, plutonium, tritium. Tritium is a really nasty substance. It's radioactive hydrogen. It is absorbed through the skin, and that is emitted all the time from reactors.
You will hear this statement that no level of radiation is safe. You know, there's radiation in the soil. If you eat bananas, there's radiation in bananas. If you fly to Denver, you're going to get radiation. At very small levels, the likelihood that you would develop cancer or some other disease from radiation exposure is extremely small. It goes up based on the amount of radiation you're exposed to.
How can they say it's okay to expose people to radiation? They know damn well it's going to increase the incidence of cancer. Have they ever seen a person die of cancer? Do they really know what this is about?
Most people my age don't assume that they're going to get cancer. And that was revolutionary to me, that other people didn't live with that fear. When I was around 10, was sort of the first inkling that something might be wrong there. On every block, people were getting sick and sicker. Something wasn't right.
I came here to have my family live in a country setting out on the pristine area of Long Island.
Where'd it go?
When my daughter Lauren was 3.5 years old, we got the results that she had this cancer called rhabdomyosarcoma that I had never heard of. As they say in the hospital, you won the unlucky lottery. Over the next year, we spent at least 2 out of every 3 weeks in the hospital. My daughter went through 11 months of chemotherapy and 6 weeks of radiation. Her friends were the kids on the floor. And, from time to time, we would lose one of those kids. It was hard. It was hard watching kids die and knowing that, you could be the next person in that situation. It could be extremely difficult. And these kids, we don't know what we lost when we lost them. What future they had, but they never had a future.
It says my chemo killed me.
So you finished your chemotherapy. Are you glad to be done with that?
Uh-huh.
I could remember one day saying all I wanted to see her do was get on the bus going to kindergarten. That's how long I was looking in the future for her. I started to talk to some of the nurses, ask them about cases of rhabdo. I had looked up the figures and it said that rhabdomyosarcoma only happened in 1 in 4 million kids a year. This was a list of the kids. This is up to 20. There was 2 kids on one street who had rhabdomyosarcoma. The statistics on that is just improbable. If this is so rare, there's something that's wrong about this. I actually called a doctor who was doing an initial study on rhabdomyosarcoma. He related the disease to exposure to low-level radiation. I said, well, where could she be getting this from around here?
So right now we're standing on Carlton, the street that was nicknamed Death Row. Pretty much almost every house on the street had somebody who was sick with cancer or something else. People started realizing that they weren't the only sick ones, their neighbors were sick as well.
We would meet in people's basements and their kitchens, and we'd talk about what we found, and we'd do research and somebody would find something.
All signs seemed to point to what was beyond this barbed wire fence.
These are all rhabdomyosarcoma cases. A is my daughter. Shirley here. All the other cases are all within the confines of real close to the Brookhaven National Laboratory. I knew there was a laboratory at Brookhaven, But I pictured this as a bunch of guys in white coats with test tubes, heating them up and, doing whatever type of experiments.
The Brookhaven National Laboratory conducts sophisticated nuclear experiments, producing an enormous amount of deadly waste.
The only research I had said that my daughter's cancer was caused by low-level radiation. And Brookhaven National Laboratory was the only source of that.
The lab sits atop the primary underground water supply for 1.3 million residents of New York's Long Island.
It's certainly not a risk to people outside the lab.
What was explained to me is that we're the scientific minds out here. We know what we're doing. And you need to trust us that we wouldn't do anything to intentionally harm you.
I remember this moment when it started to really snowball.
We recently visited with some of the parents who are dealing with their children in cancer. Please welcome Mr. Randy Snell to the show.
Randy seemed to be the one who most often talked to the press. He was a great source of dignity, and his story really hit home for me.
Well, how many surgeries did she have to go through?
She went through 5 surgeries.
At that point, I decided to join the group called Standing for Truth About Radiation. Now, we had an organized force to try to lobby to bring attention to what was going on. And it incorporated some of the more powerful people on the east end of the island.
I think that people either A, on the most ignorant level, looked at Brookhaven like any national laboratory and thought, the wonders of science, which is probably the name of the film they showed me when I was in 3rd grade. And if they don't think that, they just think it's just going to be too much of a hassle to find out the truth.
Over the years and years of researching this, I kept hoping that I would find a piece of paper that would say, oh, you're reading everything incorrectly, or actually responsibility was taken.
We did find tritium in the groundwater above the drinking water standards. We've determined that the extent of the plume is well within the site boundary, so no one is drinking the contaminated water.
They kept saying, on the Montel Williams show or in their press releases that there was no off-site plume, but very clearly this states in 91, off-site tritium plumes, southern and eastern, releases of radioactivity from the sewage treatment plant, the HWMA, and the landfills have been detected in off-site residential wells. Off-site residential wells. Area of concern 23, here and here. Off-site tritium plume, which they say does not exist. And I'll just stress again, it's not like I typed up this document. This came right out of their library.
You can have respect for science. You can have respect for all the work that's being done at BNL. But what you can't write off is they are liars. The people who run Brookhaven National Laboratory were filthy, no good, low down, scum-sucking liars.
Brookhaven Lab had been leaking for years. This is the water that we're drinking. I mean, we're all hooked up to the aquifer here, and you're bathing in it, you're washing your dishes with it. I think of my daughter Lauren. We moved in when she was a month old. To save money, we got the powdered formula. What did we mix the powder formula with? We mixed it with the water from the taps.
It's very dangerous texting while walking. I just knew it was definitely different. I knew, going to the hospital and having surgeries wasn't normal, so I couldn't dance, which is the one thing I love in the world. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. I still wonder why did something so awful could happen to a person at such a young age. I didn't ask for it. I was young. I didn't smoke. I didn't do anything that would attract cancer. My dad became my hero. Although he wasn't a doctor or an oncologist or radiologist, he still was able to make a difference in trying to figure out what was going on.
All I ever wanted was for Brookhaven to admit that they did something wrong, which they never have. When they decided not to reopen the high flux beam reactor, to me that was an admission of guilt, that you should not put a nuclear reactor on the source of water for 2.5 million people. Sometimes you can't ignore when you're getting hit in the face, and that's what I felt we were being. We were being hit in the face with all these cancers. People call me a crusader, an activist. I was being a father. If somebody tries to hurt your child, you stand up against them and you protect them.
Even better.
The NRC holds these meetings with the public at least annually, where we describe our assessment of the safety performance at any point for the prior year. And we also have a time of
once a year, even the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has to show up and tell us with a straight face, we've got your back. I bet that's their least favorite day of the year.
Let me tell you, I have never seen a situation in which a regulatory agency deserves what it's going to get tonight as much as the Nuclear Regulatory Commission deserves it.
You know, nuclear power people tend to feel very passionately about it. And so that does translate in the kind of reception we get from the public.
There are exits in the back, so if there is a fire alarm, just stand up and make your way in an orderly fashion to those exits. Thank you.
We see the day-to-day activity. Certainly we don't make policy, but in our small role of inspection, assessment, event response, very critical role, so we welcome the opportunity to have dialogue with members of the public because they're important stakeholders as well.
And the bottom line for this assessment meeting is, in 2010, Entergy operated Indian Point safely and met all the NRC's safety cornerstone objectives.
While the information that feeds into these indicators are provided by Entergy, the inspectors verified this information on every performance indicator. In summary, Indian Point operated safely in 2010. Let me finish this.
Hold on for a second. If you don't allow them to speak, you won't get the opportunity to speak. So we need you to respect us just like we're respecting you. If you continue to given the interest of people who want to speak, we will change our agenda here and we will go directly to questions and answers.
Fukushima, I'm sure they had meetings just like this, where the government told them, nuclear power, very safe. And we see what happened.
You've granted an inspection exemption from the spent fuel pool number 2, which you know has a crack in it. You know it's leaking tritium into the groundwater and into the Hudson. But you've exempted the inspection.
I'm here to remind you, it's your job to protect the public, not the industry.
You guys are supposed to have our backs. And if you want to go back and feel good about yourselves as a regulator, you better wake up tomorrow morning and find a new gear, because this will not stand. You have a war on your hands right now.
Anytime the licensor brings me anything, I question what they do. You know, is this the right thing to do? Is this the safe thing to do? Is this, piece of equipment going to work if you consider seismic events or leaks? Or, we're always questioning everything they do, and I really wish that they could see, what we do on a day-to-day basis, how important it is for us to keep these plants safe. And I live 8 miles from the plant with my family. It's very important to us too.
If you liken the NRC to the local cop on the block, and everybody liked the local cop on the block, and most NRC people I know I like. But they can only be as effective and aggressive as the mayor lets them. And in this case, the mayor is the Senate.
Congress is very involved. They want to know what kind of inspections we're carrying out to make sure these plants are safely operated. So they have a very keen interest in making sure that we're living up to our responsibilities. Then Congress decides on an annual basis how much money we're actually going to get, and Congress is going to decide what our key priorities are going to be as well.
What you have is a process in which the nuclear industry gives a lot of money to Congress and spends a lot more than that on lobbying. That results in a lot of pressure on the commission.
The only thing it can do is hold a regulator responsible. And the problem is that the regulator is responsible to Congress, and Congress is being run by lobbyists.
The Nuclear Energy Institute is the mouthpiece for the industry. No, they're very good at what they do. They just don't spend money. They spend money in a smart way, and they get tangible results. The nuclear power industry is the best example of how money and power intersect to impact policy.
These agencies, the Energy Department, the Regulatory Commission, are riddled with a lot of conscientious, smart, well-meaning people who are in a system that if you do go outside of the boundaries of what they consider good form behavior, you're on a career path to nowhere. In the late 1990s, there was a whistleblower who had basically found and reported that the owner of the Millstone 1 reactor had been engaging in a very dangerous practice of pulling out its spent fuel from the reactor before it should. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission did what you call a wire brush inspection and ordered them to shut down. This really angered a lot of Republican members of Congress, that a regulator would come in and do something like this. And the one member of Congress who was particularly outraged, who was in a position to do something about this, was Senator Pete Domenici.
I came from a state, New Mexico, and you see it out there and some people think it's a desert. Besides that, it has 2 giant laboratories. They got me indoctrinated in nuclear power, which put me into the probably most committed senator to bring back civilian nuclear power and to bring it back like Dwight Eisenhower spoke of it when it was first done.
He led the effort to introduce legislation that would cut 700 people from the payroll of the inspection program of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
Pete Domenici wrote a book, and he actually laughs about beating up on the NRC. And he said he threatened their budget. He had a come-to-Jesus meeting with the chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. From that point on, the NRC became an enabler rather than a regulator.
In recent months, as many of you have stated, the NRC has been the subject of a number of external reviews, some of them sharply critical from our congressional appropriations committees. Most NRC observers are calling for a more rapid move to a regulatory framework with licensee afforded more flexibility in meeting requirements.
So you have a prominent senator with oversight capacity who had the ability to take away aggressive regulation and did. And the NRC essentially has become a pussycat. It's really a toothless regulator. It has no bite.
In fact, we have invited the Nuclear Energy Institute, NEI, to submit to the Commission a petition for rulemaking outlining areas where it feels NRC regulations are duplicative, unnecessary in light of other rules, or not sufficiently risk-informed.
When you think of NRC, you're thinking, probably about an aggressive regulatory protocol where the industry is accountable to the NRC. This is upside down. The NRC is made to be accountable to the industry.
The village of Guiley lies right adjacent to the Braywood nuclear plant. It was always a joke, you live next to a nuclear plant, does everything glow, is it going to blow up? I used to look at that as kind of a Chicken Little syndrome, that was irrational. Because I thought all these safeguards were in place. And you see water going in, water going out, and I never had any concern for it because of my assumptions were that it was so heavily regulated.
I would sit outside and I would listen to the hum, and it would be soothing to me. And I would just sit outside like in the middle of the night and I would listen to the hum of it and be comforted by it. I thought it was a good thing. Since then, my knowledge of it, I don't find them comforting at all anymore. I find them the biggest and hugest enemy.
I always get asked about the socioeconomic area, people trying to be nice, saying, well, it's a pretty poor community. I just always believe the water and people, it doesn't really matter how much is in your wallet or your bank account. You have the same right to clean and safe drinking water. When people called me and asked me, is it safe to drink our water? I couldn't answer that. I'm a park district director. We went to the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. They didn't have the authority to go on station property. That was the NRC. We need to find answers. What could possibly get out to harm people? So we started testing. When you talk about an oh shit moment, I think mine's in a file that I have called Pioneer Environment Tritium File, October 31st of 2002. Shallow well number 2, 496 picocuries of tritium per liter. This was a groundwater well similar to what another 260 people in this community were drinking from. And that was my first inclination that there could be an issue with radionuclides leaving the plant. And then I found on the other side of the plant, 200,000 picocuries per liter.
Right there you can see the plant. Great view. If only the trees could grow taller.
First time I learned about the tritium in the nuclear leaks and stuff like that was basically in the newspaper. Exelon stood with conviction, from day one that, you have nothing to worry about, blah, blah, blah.
The tritium amounts that are in the ground are of such concentrations that they are low and they are not a health hazard to you. This tritium is not in the drinking water except for one well.
Exelon started buying up properties. They bought up a few, and it didn't take them very long at all to bulldoze it down to the ground. There's a scary thought. It's so safe and great. Why are you bulldozing down a perfectly good house? My gut instinct at that point was that, oh shit, what have they really done to us?
This again is the Kankakee River, and this is a discharge line that's going over to the Braidwood Nuclear Station. Irene and I were talking, and one of my neighbors had recently passed away, and then when I was telling her about all my neighbors, she started telling me about all her neighbors, and we're only 1.5 miles apart. This is where all the cancers are. There's Stanger, there's Tohill, there's Kavanaugh's, there's Jennings, Trimby, Delrose, Cunning, and Brockman, all in a row. Every one of these homes, without missing a house, had cancer.
This is absolutely no coincidence. It just does not go cancer, 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 cancer. This is not a coincidence. Something is wrong, definitely wrong.
Both of them died of cancer, and actually there's more right behind them. There's a driveway that goes back here. The lady died. We honestly thought that our health department and the NRC and places like that were looking out for us, but we've also found out that the NRC and Exelon are working together. And it's their job to convince us that everything they're doing is perfectly safe.
Good evening. My name is Stephen Orth, and I am the representative from the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I am the team.
Public meetings we held was a chance for people to ask the people that really are charged with their protection questions.
It was not a good vibe in there for them at that point. And all of us felt the same way. The NRC are supposed to be there overseeing these guys to protect us.
Our NRC requirements allow licensees, including nuclear power plants, to release radioactivity into the environment. We require that the releases be controlled and monitored, and that the resulting radiation doses be below the limits that we've established.
I was never aware that they were allowed or permitted to discharge radioactive effluent. If you would have asked anybody in this area, 10 years ago, they would have laughed at you. So, oh no, there's government agencies and state agencies protect us. They would never let that happen.
When we looked more into it, we found that their hands are actually basically tied from being able to do anything other than sit there and read reports that say everything is safe and great.
Why is Exelon doing the testing of these wells, and why isn't there an independent company doing the testing?
The licensee is primarily responsible for operations at its facility and for identifying and analyzing what occurs at their facility.
Our opinion of the NRC is that they sit at a desk. Exelon goes out and does all this tests and stuff like that, and they write up their paperwork and they bring it back and they're like, look, we got an A+ on our report, you know, and the guy looks at it, oh, well, look, it all falls well within the guidelines and stuff, you know. File that back in the drawer. Where are you taking me to lunch today?
We can assure you that the contamination, although in locations not originally intended, does not present a hazard to public health and safety.
We wanted them to say, hey, you know what? We're going to help you now. They didn't do that. They consistently told us the water is safe to drink.
We found out that the leaks actually happened as far back as 10 years prior. They said it was 250,000 gallons in '96 that leaked at one of the vacuum breakers. In '98 was 6 million gallons, and in 2000 was like 3 million gallons, according to them.
We were knowledgeable of the 2000 leak. The 2000 leak was reported by the licensee in their annual radiological release report, which is a public document available to anybody in this room, available to anybody on this panel.
You're telling me that the US NRC knew of the 2000 tritium leak in 2000? Is that what you said?
I'm explaining that that leak is a matter of public record.
It's a matter of public record. Because I am going back to the US NRC representative that I have a letter from who told me that they have no knowledge. And so I want to make sure that I can quote you tonight, that you state that you were aware of the 2000.
I want to get you some tritium water. Like I say, you can't smell it, you can't see it, you can't feel it, you know, but it is absorbed. Our water is not safe. We're not third world, we are America, and we should be able to turn on a water faucet and know that you've got safe drinking water. We have to get in our vehicles, whether we're young, old, disabled, and we have to go and get water filled in jugs, and I should not have to do that.
We want out, you know, just want to move away from this, you know, and we never really kind of got that opportunity to do it. We've almost been held here as nuclear hostages because they basically told us, no, you're not affected, and we're not going to be buying your property. Everybody just looks at it like, well, you know, you're just, you know, you're collateral damage, you know, and kind of sucks to be the collateral damage.
The NRC's regulations have been on the books for decades, say that you're not allowed to have a drop of tritiated water leave a plant except via a controlled and monitored pathway. Not a drop. Yet they found millions of gallons that leaked out from plants and haven't fined anybody a nickel.
We try to put things in context in terms of the risk significance. Tritium it's a weak beta emitter that generally it will pass through the body pretty readily. And we also always talk about the fact that this tritium will dilute too. Obviously, if it gets in the nearby river, or I mean, the dilution factor will come into play as well.
You get up in the morning, you have a drink of water, brush your teeth, you make an assumption that everything's fine. Somebody's taking care of that water. Somebody's testing it, it's safe for me, it's healthy, until you start finding out things. They use the term stakeholders. Who are stakeholders? You know, well, people. We're one of the primary stakeholders. You know, we're not in this for profit. We're just here to live.
Nuclear, it's clean energy. Nuclear, it's clean energy. Clean burning nuclear power. And you're like, what the fuck are you talking about? Nuclear power is do they think that nuclear rods come off the nuclear rod tree? We go pick them from the nuclear rod orchard?
Ultimately, this nuclear story comes down to waste. Even if something works perfectly and there are no leaks, no spills, no accidents, we're creating a multitude of fission products: strontium, tritium, cesium, and all of these have a profound effect on the human body. A lot of these fission products have half-lives from 10 years to plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. However, half-life is different than when it is no longer dangerous to human interaction. When you take that into consideration, it turns into 240,000 years.
It's been estimated that by the end of this century, 1/4 of the country's energy output could be derived from nuclear power. But before that can happen, some way must be found to get rid of deadly radioactive residue forever.
Let me put it to you this way. Would you buy a house from a developer who said, hey, I'm going to put a toilet in, but there'll be no septic system for 30 years, and we're just going to let the human turds pile up in the front yard for 30 years? All right, the nuclear turds have been piling up in the front yard for 30, 40 years. Nobody I know wants to live next to a high-level radioactive waste site. We didn't sign up for that. We signed up to live near a nuclear power plant.
Here in Idaho, for example, barrels of radioactive waste are merely covered up with dirt, while a nearby nuclear reactor continues to churn out still more waste.
Waste was an issue from the early stages of the Manhattan Project. But at that point, of course, during the Manhattan Project, the focus was almost exclusively on building the bomb, and waste was a problem for later. The commercial nuclear power industry boomed in the late 1960s to everyone's surprise.
Scientists estimate that within the next 10 years, nuclear power plants will be turning out a railroad car full of radioactive waste every 24 hours.
The Atomic Energy Commission suddenly felt under a great deal of pressure to find a site for high-level waste from power reactors.
The Atomic Energy Commission wants to buy 2,000 acres of land near Lyons, Kansas, for use as an atomic waste dumping ground.
The favored solution at that time was salt.
Scientists believe the vast deposits of salt out here will make an ideal container for radioactive materials.
You put the waste in a salt deposit, the salt kind of envelops the waste, and then it's safe. So that was the theory at that point. The AEC conducted its own environmental impact study and concluded that, yeah, Lyons looks pretty good.
After several years of research, the AEC announced the plan was safe, that the radioactive waste could be permanently sealed and buried.
Unfortunately, Lyons, Kansas turned out not to be the place.
While Lyons residents didn't object to the project, scientists at the University of Kansas did. They were not convinced rock formations above the salt mine, where the nuclear waste was to be buried, could withstand the extreme heat generated by the radioactive material.
And in the end, the site turned out to be extremely unsuitable, and it wasn't rocket science to figure this out. The AEC could have known about that, should have known about it, and simply didn't do its homework.
The advent of nuclear technology has created another problem: what to do with the tons and tons of radioactive waste.
Congress has ordered the Department of Energy to find a stable underground location to isolate the waste from everything and everybody for 10,000 years.
Finally, in 1982, Congress said, well, we have to find a solution to this problem, so here's what it is. DOE is going to investigate sites and find 3 that are suitable and recommend those to the president. There's all kinds of public opposition in the area surrounding the 3 sites.
No state wants to take nuclear waste that stays radioactive for thousands of years.
And therefore, the process is not working, and so we're going to designate a single site, and that site, of course, was Yucca Mountain.
Scientists are gambling that Yucca Mountain, an hour-and-a-half's drive northwest of Las Vegas, is the perfect spot to store the nuclear waste because of its remote desert location.
If you talk to the Nevada people, they will say it was a screw Nevada bill, that they didn't have the clout to stop
a site in their state from being designated.
Nevada Senator Harry Reid says Yucca Mountain isn't about science, it's about money.
This is all a brainwashed job from a very powerful industry. The nuclear power industry is as good at throwing money around as anyone I've ever seen. In fact, I think they're better.
The U.S. government moved closer today to making Yucca Mountain, Nevada, the underground storage site for this country's nuclear waste. As expected, President Bush today approved the Yucca site.
With the president and Congress on board, billions of dollars already in the ground, using Yucca Mountain to store nuclear waste might seem like a foregone conclusion.
The Obama administration has been clear that storing nuclear waste at Yucca Mountain is off the table. The 27-year-old project has seen its budget slashed by Congress in the past several years.
As I understand it, President Obama instructed Secretary of Energy to withdraw.
Energy Secretary Stephen Chu said that scientists have learned more about the repository, making it less of an ideal option to store the country's nuclear waste.
Taking Yucca Mountain off the table in terms of a long-term solution for a repository for our nuclear waste is the science. The science ought to make these decisions.
There are concerns about geological issues, especially seismic issues. And of course, Senator Reid is a strong opponent of Yucca Mountain. So I think that's the main reason.
And to have the president, in effect, zero it out of his budget is a dream come true for so many thousands and thousands of people in Nevada.
Now the Nuclear Regulatory Commission must decide if it wants to restart what is already a 25-year, $14 billion project. A former staffer for Senator Reid, Greg Yatsko, now chairs the NRC.
It was a difficult decision, because it is such a controversial program. But again, it was one that was made, and I believe, in the best interest of the agency.
Until the court cases are resolved or until something else happens, there's no progress at all. The waste now is on site at the 100 or so nuclear power plants that are generating power in this country.
I think that America now has a future for more nuclear power creation. I have no problem with that as long as you leave it where it's created. That is the power. It'll be safe for 100 years, and by then America will have some way of taking care of it permanently.
The Japanese government has released a bleak picture of the fallout from the accident at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. The new survey measures levels of radioactive cesium-137 in soil near the damaged facility, and it shows the spread and seriousness of the contamination.
The survey confirms the appalling magnitude of the contamination. I was hoping I'd be able to return someday to spend my last years in my hometown. But the map suggests even that won't be possible.
Japanese Prime Minister Naoto Kan says Japan needs to review its nuclear policies. He aims for the country to become a leader in new energy sources after the nuclear crisis at the Fukushima Daiichi plant.
Germany's government agreed this morning to phase out all of its nuclear power plants by the year 2022. It's the first major power to become nuclear-free since the disaster in Japan.
Celebrations in Rome as anti-nuclear protesters marked a big win, an end to the country's nuclear program. As you can see in the square behind me, people are celebrating a resounding defeat to Silvio Berlusconi, who just 2 years ago was saying that nuclear power was the future for Italy. Clearly what happened in Japan has encouraged people to say that they didn't want nuclear power here, and that is why we've had such a massive vote against it. We're told 95% in fact.
I really thought about within a week after Fukushima, okay, nuclear renaissance, off the table.
In light of what's happened in Japan, I would like to hear what you believe President Obama's position is now on nuclear power generally in the United States. Does he still support a rebirth of nuclear power and construction of new plants? Could you just give us your best estimate of what his position is?
The present budget is what it is, and we're asking for loan guarantees. That position has not been changed.
So that's a yes.
That's a yes.
Good. That's what I wanted you to say. See, if you just said yes, and easy. Now, with regards to the loan guarantees, given again what's happened, do you and the President want the Congress to support the full $36 billion that you have put in the President's budget?
Yes.
Okay. You're learning. You're not a Nobel Prize winner for nothing, I guess, huh?
I'm a common person. I really don't want a label put on me. I don't feel I'm an activist. I don't feel I'm anti-nuclear. I turn on a light switch. I want to pay a reasonable electric bill. I have questions if it should be built next to where people live, drink. If they're going to build more of these reactors, it all boils down to the issue of trust. Trust in the agencies and trust in the industry. How are they going to do it differently? Do you really learn from your mistakes? That's my major question right now in this point of time.
We should be worrying about the entire range of problems that are posed by an aging nuclear fleet that is a 20th century technology that looks pretty scary in a 21st century world. We need to continue to push the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to protect the public from true risk, not keep this industry operating.
The NRC has always had critics, probably always will. People want to know, could the nuclear power plant in their community be affected the way those Japanese reactors were? And they want to know what their federal regulator is doing to ensure that that would not occur.
I fully expect that there are going to be lessons that we're going to learn. And likely because of those lessons, we'll be making changes to the way that we do business and the way that the industry does business in this country.
The safety of these plants is our foremost task, and I think if you look at the operation of most of these plants, the track record has been pretty good, and I think the oversight by the NRC has played a big role in that.
I'm not here for the money. I'm not for sale. I'm here because our community was affected negatively by a nuclear accident. I've been doing it for 31 years. So I'm not getting rich doing this. Nobody's paying me to do this. What I wanted to do, and this has happened quite frequently, is after Fukushima, a lot of attention has been refocused on nuclear power. And there's a lot of people here I know, most of who thought I'd be in prison by now, but I know we're all one community. I don't view us as being anti-nuclear or pro-nuclear. We're pro-community. I just think it's time for us to fess up, be adults, and say, look, we're not mature enough as a civilization to harness the atom. Maybe sometime down the road, but not now. We have the opportunity to do it differently, to do it correctly, to do it cleanly. We choose not to. And that's because there's an intersection of money and politics, and it meets at your local nuclear power plant.
They've never said, I'm sorry. They've never admitted to being anything but a good neighbor. If they don't understand what they did to Long Island, then how can we communicate what the possibilities are, what the possible risks are for the rest of the United States if we start building nuclear reactors again? We all live downstream from something. Really, the only thing you can do is learn about what you're downstream from and try and protect yourself from it. The only thing that makes me not completely hopeless is really my son. When I first became pregnant, you know, one of the big questions is where to raise him. And when we found the perfect place, it was one of the few counties that I've ever come across that doesn't have anything that comes up on the EPA's search. I thought, yes, this is where I can happily and safely raise him. But again, it's that boulder on a precipice feeling that the invisible somehow will lace the air that I breathe, the water that I drink. It just feels like any moment it's going to walk up my driveway.